Tell me everything.
Hey, welcome back to ScreenCrush. I'm Colton Ogburn, and these are all the Easter eggs, references, and little things you might have missed in Severance Season 2, Episode 8, Sweet Vitriol. This episode catches us up with Miss Cobell, who we last saw on the run from Lumen after this nearly fatal encounter with Helena. Turns out her long car journey has been to the seaside town of Salt's Neck, which we saw signed for earlier this season on her first attempt at making this trek home. And oh my god, did this episode reveal the truth behind so many Lumen and Kier mysteries. Oh, and hey, speaking of Kier, be sure to check out our Praise Kier sticky note shirt up on the merch store right now, ScreenCrushMerch.com. And a little later, I am going to be joined by the ScreenCrush video analysis team to get their thoughts and theories on this episode. And then after that, I want to talk about how this episode and the previous one with Gemma have pushed me to the point that I think the next season, season 3, will have to be the final season of Severance. So the title of this episode, Sweet Vitriol, has a few deeper meanings to discuss. Vitriol can be defined as cruel and bitter criticism. This of course echoes Sissy's vitriol for Harmony.
Such a disappointment you've proven to be.
And the idiom sweet vitriol essentially means to take pleasure in projecting those feelings of cruel criticism onto someone else. But there is an even deeper meaning to this title that ties into the town and the ether factory. Sweet vitriol is actually the name for the chemical compound that is formed when distilling ethanol and sulfuric acid, creating diethyl ether. Now, throughout this series, we have heard mention of the ether factory where Kier worked and where he met his wife Imogene. There's even this painting on the severed floor depicting this meeting. And later in the episode, Harmony even mentions that the two met at this factory.
Kier and Imogen met at the ether mill.
So in the opening sequence, we see this iceberg, which reminded me of the iceberg picture hanging in now Milchick's office, that this iceberg is likely a photo or a rendering inspired by the icebergs in Salt's Neck. We've previously discussed how icebergs could be imagery for the Ernest Hemingway iceberg theory of storytelling, where the mysteries of a story are like that of an iceberg, and the expression only the tip of the iceberg alluding to many more answers to be found below, which is of course the style in which Severance is written, and the Lumen building itself is a physical representation of this iceberg writing theory, with the answers to all of our questions lying deeper and deeper in the depths of Lumen, beyond that of even the severed floor, giving us more and more answers the deeper we go, like in last week's episode on the testing floor. And then that theme is continued in this episode, showing us literal icebergs, but also giving us a ton of new information regarding the mysteries of Lumen, its origins, and of course, Miss Cobell. So when Harmony arrives in Salt Neck, we see this unhoused man sniffing from a bag. This, of course, will later be revealed as the ether that everyone in the town appears to be addicted to. And I thought this whole little subplot with the ether was very reminiscent of real-world coal miner towns that can be found in states like West Virginia. In those towns, coal miners frequently develop fatal cancers from their years and years of work in the mines. This is paralleled with those of Salt's Neck and their fatal illnesses from working in the ether factory. We see this woman is on oxygen, and we know that Harmony's mother was also on oxygen and was sick from her time at the ether factory. Now, in our real world, coal miners are usually neglected by their former employers who take no responsibility for their illness and offer no help, just like we're seeing here with Lumen. This little factory town built Lumen into the company it is today, but the workers who built it have been long forgotten and abandoned. Now, this ties into the series' overall theme of major corporations and their mistreatment of the working class. Now, this also ties into the opioid epidemic that was prevalent, again, in areas like West Virginia and amongst coal miners, where pharmaceutical companies flooded the area with pain meds for injured coal miners, pain meds that they knew were addictive and life-threatening. We're seeing the same thing happen here with the ether that everyone has become addicted to from their time at the factory. One thing I love about this show is the constant wondering of what's true and what's really happening in the layers and layers of Lumen deception, as well as the welcome deceptions that the show's writers use to keep us on our toes. But the place where I do not want lies, deceptions, or misdirects is where I consume my news, and that's why I use Ground News. They're the sponsor of this video. Ground News is an app and website that gathers related articles from across the world into one place, but they give you the context about the source's political leanings, as well as their reliability and their ownership. This means that you can see through the bias and think critically about the news you consume. For example, here's a story about President Trump's recent comments regarding Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky and his stance on Russia's invasion of Ukraine. A left-leaning site like HuffPost pointed out that President Trump is attacking President Zelensky, quote, again, while a right-leaning site like Fox News focused more so on President Trump's negative characterization of Zelensky and his stance on the possibility of a ceasefire. Now, if you look here, we can see that this story was covered by 27 left-leaning sites, 36 right-leaning sites, and 17 in the center. Best of all, we can see the media ownership of each article. You see, I want to know that the news isn't trying to sway me one way or the other, and Ground News even has a blind spot section that shows you news stories that each side is ignoring. For instance, here's a story about 30 officers being accused of making children fight in a California juvenile hall. 57% of the articles covering this story are left-leaning, while only 14% are right-leaning. So Ground News is an incredible resource, and I've been looking for a service like Ground News for years. I highly encourage you to check them out, and if you go to ground.news/SC or click this QR code, you will get 40% off their Vantage plan, which includes unlimited access to every feature. This is their best deal of the year, and it's only available for a limited time. Your subscription will not only help this channel, but you'll also be supporting an independent platform working to make the media landscape more transparent. Now, back to Severance. So we see Devon calling Harmony several times throughout this episode, tying back to the previous episode when Devon was calling her for help regarding Mark's reintegration.
I have custody of his brain now. You don't. I'm calling her.
So throughout the town, we also see the Lumen logo on various buildings. When Harmony says,
We were once chums. Old colleagues lift each other up.
Colleagues. Child labor.
this was the first of many connections to Miss Wong. All season, we've been wondering why the hell there was a kid down on the severed floor.
Why are you a child?
Because of when I was born.
We then heard mention from Milchek of the Winter Tide program, which we theorized at the time was a school of sorts. Now, at the time, I also theorized that Winter Tide could be in reference to the Lovecraft Universe book by the same name, which is part of the Innsmouth Legacy series. Innsmouth being a fictional port town created by Lovecraft that also featured great decay and even a cult-like following within the town.
Sounds familiar.
And I'm feeling pretty vindicated with the introduction of Salt's Neck, a decaying port town with a cult. Once again, connecting Severance to the cosmic horror storytelling, also known as Lovecraftian storytelling. So anyway, this mention of child labor shows us that Lumen has always included the exploitation and essentially grooming of children as a part of their growth strategy for global domination. And Miss Wong, like Miss Cobell, is on the path to becoming a future leader at Lumen to serve Kier and the Egans. Now, at Harmony's old home, we can see Harmony's heights on the doorframe with various ages. This is a great way of letting us know that this was her childhood home where she grew up. I really love this because it's a great example of how this series shows us things instead of just telling us things. Seriously, other modern shows and movies really need to take note on this. Now, as we venture into the hall, this plaque reads Lumen Ether Youth Apprentice Matron, Quarterly Striver, Celestine Sissy Cobell.
What a mouthful.
And this shows us that Harmony comes from a long line of Cure followers, and it shows us that in this town, like many port towns or factory towns, pretty much everyone worked at the factory, and the factory is part of their way of life.
There was no town before the factory.
We also saw this in another Lovecraftian show with coal miners in True Detective Night Country. It really is crazy how many similarities these shows are starting to have. Anyway, the plaque also reads fourth quarter year of vision, again showing us how they tell time based on the 9 core principles. Sissy says,
Why do you bring nothing but woe into my life?
woe of course being one of the 4 tempers. So here we can see a shrine to Kier similar to the one Harmony had in her house that we saw back in season 1. We see this newspaper with James Egan, Helena's father and current CEO of Lumen, and the article reads, James Egan assumes role as Lumen CEO. We also see this picture of Kier, which we also saw in Harmony's shrine. Here there are some paper mache figurines of the 4 tempers, and here are what look like merit badges and of course some goats. And then down here on the table we we can see what looks kind of like tarot cards with the 9 core principles on them. We see verve, vision, probity, and benevolence. We also see this little card that says you must be cut to heal, which ties into this episode's theme of shining a light on child labor, as well as the overall theme of the series, which is essentially a commentary on the mistreatment of workers by major corporations like Lumen, usually coded in this, oh, we're helping you, your hard work will pay off bullshit. In reality, like those who own the coal mines and those who pushed opioids, they don't care about the people. They care about the profit, and they completely disregard the workers. So once Harmony finds the key to her mother's room, in there we see a framed picture of her as a child sporting the pigtails that we see her rocking here in season 1. Now, like we mentioned earlier, it's clear that not only has this town and its residents been abused and abandoned by Lumen, many suffering from an ether addiction, but also fatal illnesses caused from years of work in the factory. We see Harmony's mother was one of the victims of these fatal illnesses. Harmony's mother was one of the victims of these fatal illnesses. And we see Harmony put her late mother's oxygen tube in her mouth, the same kind of oxygen tube that we saw here in her Cure Shrine in season 1 with her mother's name on this tag. So in the cellar, we see a yearbook, the Myrtle Egan School for Girls Annual Reminiscence. Now, Myrtle Egan was a former CEO of Lumen that we actually saw here in season 1. She was the daughter of Kier himself. And I think it's safe to assume that Miss Wong also attended this same school. Now, in the annual, we see that Harmony was valedictorian, and we see her pictured here with James Egan as the recipient of the Wintertide Fellowship. So Harmony was looking for this bust, and I loved that a little earlier in the episode, you see her realize where the key is hidden and ultimately where the papers are hidden when she looks at the little Kier stone that Sissy was holding in her hand. It being a Kier knick-knack pointing her to the shrine, and it being the head of an Egan, which pointed her to the James Egan bust. So in that bust, we learn, turns out, Harmony is responsible for essentially the creation of the Severance procedure.
Mine! My design!
She mentions the circuit blueprint, the Glasgow block we saw in episode 4, the overtime contingency from the season 1 finale. It was all hers. We even see the sketches of these same brainwaves separating the severed self from the outie self, the same waves we saw here when Mark was being reintegrated by Ragabi. Okay, so again, the theme of this episode and this show as a whole is the theme of exploitation, child labor, slave labor, and now stolen credit from a lifelong dedicated employee. And I have a theory for what's next for Harmony and why they took the time to give us this backstory for her character, and I want to share all of that with you here shortly. But first, I want to bring in our ScreenCrush video analysis team. We have Pete F., Shri R., and Elias K. joining me today. I want to talk about what I am calling yet another Severance bottle episode, but I do not say that in a negative way. Like, Walking Dead did a lot of bottle episodes that, you know, like didn't focus on like the main character, and that would annoy the shit out of me. But it seems like when they do it with Severance, I just don't care. I am just so invested. But I'm wondering if that opinion is shared here. Pete, what did you think of this episode?
It's interesting that you put it that way, because one of the things that I took away from it was it felt like it could have been part of another episode, sort of like when Bert and Irving were part of another larger episode. But at the same time, they took the time to go so deep, and I'm really curious to hear where you're going with that, because it was the shortest episode, but it was still 37 minutes of really going deep into something that by the time it ended felt like it might not have needed to have given us that much time. But I'm sure there's a reason for it, because nothing happens in Severance by accident.
Well, it felt like, have you guys ever heard that joke how the US was like colonized from, if you're looking at the map, from right to left, but it looks like it was colonized from left to right? Like some, like they said, all right, you got to fit 50 states in this drawing here. And then like at the end, they crammed it. Right. That's what I felt this episode was like. Cause like halfway through, I'm like, is anything going to happen? And then a lot happened. And I actually ended up liking the episode. The first few minutes, I was kind of on it. Shri, what did you think?
So it's interesting that you mentioned that, Colton, because initially I felt the same as you guys. It was a short episode. Nothing really happened at first, and a lot happened at the end. And so initially I was like I'll be honest, this was not my favorite episode of the season. But thinking back on it now, I do think it could have been part of a bigger episode, but I do think it was necessary, not only for the information they gave in terms of dialogue, But if you look back at the initial 15 minutes before they do any sort of actual talking, the camera work and the cinematography is not only so beautiful, but so important too, because they're doing what we criticize a lot of other TV shows do, which is they tell, they don't show. However, there's a lot of show and not telling in the first 15 minutes of this episode. Especially, I was previously talking with Elias here, where they're doing a lot of showing of the setting and how decrepit the town of Salt Neck is, when it should have been one of the most flourishing towns because of its connection to the Egans, to Kier, to Lumen. And it was one of the most fundamental towns of the industry. However, the overarching treatment of Kier, of the Egans, of Lumen, it shows that that is not what they, propose to be to the world.
Yeah, I mean, the show, and especially this episode, it's essentially a commentary on, like, I'd say the American working class, like I talked about in the breakdown. It shows, I think we're seeing themes of like the opioid epidemic that happened like in West Virginia, and how coal miners, they got sick. They also got peddled all of these pharmaceuticals that they knew weren't safe. We're seeing that kind of combined here, and with their town being abandoned. I think they're handling it really well. And I don't know, it's like it's super on the nose without feeling like it's super on the nose. So they're just executing it super well. Elias, you're a huge fan of this show. You sent me a lot of notes on this episode. Very, very appreciated. What did you think overall? And did you have any like theories that you wanted to share with us? Anything like that?
Oh, yeah. Quite a few, actually. Well, firstly, I really did, like Shu just said, I really enjoyed the opening setting shots. I really feel like I typically miss those shots, and most shows, like a lot of times they don't really give us where, they don't place TV shows or like towns or things of that nature. And I think in doing so, it really does just show the quality of the town and the way it's being upkept. But something that I did notice was in one of the extra wide shots of the entire town, we see a harbor and we see like 3 docks. And obviously it's cold up there. We see snow shots, we see the icebergs. And I'm just like, cold harbor town? Code word for Salt Neck? I feel like that's something that I was like, waiting for them to like just drop. If someone's just like, oh, let's get out of this cold harbor or something, and just I'm waiting for one of those.
Well, they do in this show, like I think every episode does like the Family Guy, like, he said it, where they say the title of the episode in the episode, which I appreciate. One of our editors, Lee Mazzio, actually sent me a tweet, and I'm sorry to spring this on you guys. I just thought about it as Elias was talking. There was like an Easter egg found where the same number that's associated with the Cold Harbor file is Helly's like employee number. Have you guys seen that?
I saw that tweet. Yeah. Yep.
Okay, fill me in. Somebody fill me in, because I just happened to glance at that a little bit before we got started.
I mean, I think it's literally what you said. It's associated with her employee number, the Cold Harbor. I just literally think that, I don't know if it's something as deep as what we're hoping it is, or it is just a nod to how important both this character and this specific file is really important to what's going to happen later, because we know Mark's work in Cold Harbor is one of the most important things to happen to Lumen Industries. Helena Egan is going to be the up-and-coming CEO that's going to revolutionize the industry. So I do think just her relationship with Mark and that relationship with Cold Harbor, the Cold Harbor case, is going to be just how important the show is going to end up being.
My personal theory on it is, so we never saw the inside of the Cold Harbor room in the previous episode. We know Gemma still has to go to that room. And we've talked about in our breakdowns through this season and in the intro for the show, they're doing a lot of like telling us through like imagery that Helena and Gemma are like connected. Like we see them glitching, we see them being each other's reflection. We see Helena like pursuing Mark. Of course, Mark and Helly have their relationship. I think there's something going on there where Mark and Gemma's relationship, they're like trying to maybe transcode that over to Helly and like have Helena have that relationship with Mark? What do you guys think about that?
I like that idea of, because as we saw in the last episode where they're just sort of putting Gemma through all these different trials essentially and downloading. And I think we've all sort of come to the conclusion that whatever's happening with those numbers is sort of filling the mind or the slots for the personalities that's going into whoever's in there and whatever they're doing. But I think it really makes a lot of sense that maybe they are trying to capture what they're ultimately trying to capture is that relationship part between Gemma and Mark, and trying to transfer it into Helly and see if they can reproduce love, perhaps, which would be tremendous.
And correct me if I'm wrong. I think every Lumen CEO has been an Egan, right? Every Lumen CEO is an Egan. If Helena is, next in line to become CEO, but she's never found like love in the world, it makes sense that they're like, okay, well, we got to make this happen. She has to have an offspring to continue the lineage. I don't want to get too far off from this episode. Elias, is Harmony like a good guy now? Like, she used to kind of be in this villainous role, but now I'm kind of rooting for her. Like, when she called Mark and was like, tell me everything, I was like, yeah, tell her everything. Let's go.
Right. I would venture to say that maybe she's had a change of heart through this episode by being reminded of her foundation with her mother's experience, her grandmother's experience or who I'm assuming is her grandmother, in their experience in Lumen. And I think having this whole realization that her plans have been fully copied and just used for outside of her own benefit, and she's not gotten any of the credit for it. I think if I was Harmony, that would have been my switch to be like, all right, I'm on the good guys team now. Tell me everything you know. Like, what can I do?
Did you guys get that impression as well, that Sissy is her grandmother? That's what I got from it.
I got something similar. It was either grandmother or her mother's sister or something of like an older maternal figure that kind of replaced Charlotte.
I think it's interesting and I'm trying to get to the bottom of it, and hopefully we will in the next couple episodes, but why she's so upset that she didn't get credit, right? And I understand there's the sort of the personal pride and whatnot, but when you work for a company, when you work for a healthcare company or any company that discovers innovation, you don't get it. The company owns it, right? If you work for Disney and you design a character, it's a Disney character. So there's got to be a deeper connection between why she wants to, and I'm not even sure if she wants credit for it so much as she maybe now sees it as an opportunity to undo what she sees. And maybe that's why the timing of Mark being reintegrated is perfect, because now she can take her notes and look at what built the chip in the process and maybe reverse engineer that and save him.
One of my theories for that is the introduction of Helly and her severance process, because when they had the conversation outside the car in the parking lot, and she said, I went through industry, I went through all of the proper Lumen pathways, and what Kier was built up in this town, the Wintertide Fellowship, the Child Factory, all of that. But I showed faith, I showed dedication. You, however, you were born into this, and she's making all of these Helly, her innie, is making all these mistakes. Rebelli, she doesn't have the core Lumen pride in her, like, let's say her innie soul, right? Yeah. She has seen what Helly can actually be like. So she doesn't have that, and yet she is being celebrated as this almost new CEO, whereas everything that kind of built up Lumen and all these technologies were literally Harmony's inventions. So it's kind of I see how it doesn't really matter if I put in all this work and I gave my faith, I got nothing from it. So now kind of let's take down the whole system.
So now the show is actually exploring another area, and that is the power of faith, right? And if you believe in whatever your church is and they turn their back on you, what does that do to you as a person? That's a really great perspective. I love that.
She feels betrayed.
Yeah.
She never cared about having credit until she was betrayed, until this cult and this company and this life, this family that she has dedicated her entire life to, and then she's fired, and then I'm pretty sure they were going to kill her or like, you know, switch her over to being somebody else. She feels betrayed. She's ready to burn the place down. It was my read on it.
The phrase Helena actually used, you have overestimated your, I think, what was it? Your contributions to this company. Whereas, and you're overestimating what you're worth to this company. She's literally telling this founder, this idol of the, you know, Egan line is telling her, you don't mean as much as you think you do. Whereas we now find out Harmony actually created most of what we now associate with Lumen, with the severance procedure, with everything. So,
yeah, she's realizing she's a cog in a machine, and I hate to sound like a broken record, but it really is a commentary on workers being betrayed by like the owning class. That's exactly what we're seeing here. She has dedicated everything, not only to the business, but Pete, like you were saying, her faith, all of that is now being challenged. And I loved seeing that the puff peddler. Did we ever catch his name? Actually, I'm not sure that we did. No. I loved when he said, "Come tame these tempers, assholes." That was the perfect cap for the episode, with the theme of it being Harmony is done. Like, I think she is done. And oh my God, has Lumen created like the most dangerous possible enemy? The Ennies probably never stood a chance at taking down Lumen, but now they've got, you know, they got cocky, and now they're on Harmony's bad side. I think we're in trouble here.
I would completely agree too, because even in terms of her next goals, I feel like it's very interesting that she was the one who originally made like the severance procedure, because it makes me wonder what her motives would have been. Because if her mother was sick, as we saw, I feel like it could have been an attempt to try to save or prolong her mother's life, or try to fix whatever the issue was, not necessarily through cloning, but by trying to attain either immortality or giving her a second life through severance or things of that nature. And I feel like now that she's had to now that she's had the experience of truly processing her emotions, which she obviously has been thinking about all through season 1, carrying around the extra breathing tube that was her mother's, I think now that she's really released that, she can kind of see that her work is not being used for the good intentions that she originally wrote them for or invented them for. And I think that's also another betrayal that she's feeling, that she's like, I was trying to save my family, but now you won't even save the town that we lived in, you and Egan. And it's like, it's a really interesting thing, because especially if Cold Harbor is this project that's so important, and this is the town that is Cold Harbor by like the names or whatever, I think it'd be very interesting to see if maybe the original Cold Harbor plan was to try to prolongate the original town's life, or to try to fix or maybe erase it and do the opposite entirely.
Well, all the people in the coffee shop were senior citizens, and that was one thing that I definitely caught, was everybody in the town was old. The proprietor of the coffee shop was the youngest guy in town.
The only other young person that was mentioned was in the very beginning of the Drippy Pot Cafe scene, who just died or had this insane snow accident with a toboggan or a plow. I think it was a plow, 2-ton plow fell on him. So very interesting that even the infrastructure in that way is harming the citizens.
Well, guys, I do have bad news. I think that this episode means, and it has shown to me, season 3 has to be the final season of Severance, and that's what I'm going to talk about here next. I want to thank you 3 so much for joining me, Shri, Elias, Pete. You can find their socials down in the description below. Thank you guys so much for joining me. Now, here's why this is the penultimate season of Severance. So, guys, my personal theory is that we are going to see Harmony essentially become a good guy. She truly bought into all of this Kier bullshit and seemingly thought that she was doing something good for the world, and we're essentially seeing that world crumble around her, and I think that that is why she is so angry throughout the series. She is slowly realizing that her entire life was a lie. And I am really excited to see her, Ragabi, Mark, Devin, Irving, Dylan, Helly, Gemma, and maybe even Mr. Milchek work together to bring down Lumen. This would continue the theme of the series in this season by giving us a worker solidarity moment between all of these employees who have been burned by the Egans and Lumen. And we could see a revolt begin to form, leading us into season 3, which I think has to be the final season of this awesome show. Here's why. I love mystery box shows like Severance, and this series has been a true return to form for television as a storytelling format. It's up there with the quality of shows like Succession and Breaking Bad, and something that those shows had in common is that they knew when to stop. Season 1 of Severance was us living in the mystery and starting to question things. Season 2 has been reveal after reveal to all of our burning questions, and it is only natural that Season 3 be the third and final chapter where we see that final showdown. This Lovecraftian style of storytelling doesn't work when it's drawn out for too long, and at a certain point it just becomes annoying and ultimately anticlimactic. And I don't want that for this show, and I'm pretty sure they don't either. We have 2 episodes left this season, and I think they are going to be pretty intense, and I cannot wait to break them down with you here on the channel. I want to hear your thoughts on this episode down in the comments below, or you can at me on Twitter or find me on our Discord, link in the description below. If you're new here, be sure to subscribe and smash that bell for alerts. For ScreenCrush, I'm Colton Ogburn.